Today, we are wading into one of the most intellectually compelling and, frankly, ethically vexing conflicts in modern medicine, the power of the placebo effect.
It's a huge topic, and for decades, the medical community really operated under this one fundamental rule.
Right, that the therapeutic benefit of a placebo requires secrecy. It only works if you don't know what's happening.
Exactly. And that orthodoxy, it created this enormous ethical and philosophical problem. I mean, think about it. How can you be a transparent, honest physician who prioritizes patient autonomy?
While at the same time needing to deceive that very same patient for the treatment to work.
It's a contradiction. That dogma was really cemented back in 1955 by figures like Henry Beecher.
Oh, right. His work, based on his wartime research, essentially codified the rule. For a placebo to elicit a response, it has to be concealed. If the patient figures it out, poof, the magic vanishes.
And that created what some have called an ethical double-blind purgatory. It's just completely incompatible with the post-1960s emphasis on informed consent, on patient rights.
That tension must have been unbearable for practitioners. You have this tool, the placebo response, which is a real powerful psychobiological tool.
Yeah.
But to use it, you have to break the fundamental trust with your patient.
And the surveys showed just how many doctors were struggling with this. It led to widespread, ethically ambiguous, deceptive prescribing. It was happening all the time.
So that brings us to the core of our deep dive today. This revolutionary, completely counterintuitive idea that challenges this whole dilemma. Open label placebos, or OLP.
The impossible question.
Can you look someone in the eye, tell them they are taking an inert sugar pill, and still somehow activate their internal healing mechanisms?
And the sources we've gathered today, they suggest the answer is, well, a resounding yes.
Which just flips our entire understanding of mind-body healing on its head.
It really does.
So our mission for this deep dive, tailored specifically for you, the listener, is to really unpack this evidence stack.
Yeah.
We need to figure out how OLP manages to be ethical while still somehow being effective.
And we'll get into the surprising neurobiological models that explain the deep mechanics, especially this idea of the Bayesian brain.
Yes, and finally, we'll look at how this really transparent method of prescribing compares to the much murkier world of off-label drug use, which often involves its own kind of therapeutic ambiguity, but without any of the transparency. Okay, so let's start with the sheer scale of the ethical problem that traditional placebos presented. Every physician takes an oath, right? An oath that requires them to give adequate, truthful information about treatments.
That covenant of trust is everything. It's the foundation of the relationship. Yet historically, if a doctor suspected a placebo might help, they basically had to conceal the truth.
And this wasn't just some, academic discussion. This was routine practice.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the data from the UK. A survey of primary care doctors there revealed that a staggering 97%, 96% reported using either a pure placebo, like a sugar pill, or an impure one.
What's an impure placebo for our listeners?
That would be something like, say, prescribing an antibiotic for a viral infection. The doctor knows it won't work on the virus, but the patient expects a pill, and that ritual itself can have an effect.
Okay, so it's an act of medicine, just for the wrong reason.
Correct. And what's even more striking is that 77% of those doctors reported using them at least weekly.
Weekly, wow.
Yes. So this shows that intentional deception was just. It was deeply embedded in the routine management of patient expectations.
And that kind of routine, intentional deception, it has to risk profound damage to the doctor-patient relationship. I mean, it's a violation of trust that could erode faith in the entire medical system if it became widely known.
It's a huge risk. And even the American Medical Association, the AMA, they tried to navigate this tight spot with guidelines that, frankly, kind of implied that sanctioned masking was sometimes necessary.
Sanctioned masking, I like that term.
Their guidance sort of allowed for physicians to justify using placebos if certain criteria were met. Often it relied on the idea that the patient knew a placebo might be used, say in a blinded trial, but they couldn't identify the specific pill.
So is this idea that authorized deception is somehow a lesser ethical evil than an outright lie?
Right. It was a very fine line they were trying to walk.
And this is precisely where OLP just enters the stage and performs a complete conceptual judo flip.
It really does. OLP fundamentally argues that the entire premise that deception is necessary is just false.
So what does it look like in practice?
Well, OLP involves administering an inert substance. It's often microcrystalline cellulose, which is essentially just a sugar pill. But the critical element, the absolute key, is the disclosure.
The honesty.
The honesty. The physician explicitly informs the recipient that the pill is pharmacologically inactive. It has no medicine in it. And this is usually presented alongside a specific detailed rationale.
A story, almost.
A story, yes. A rationale about the power of mind-body connections and the body's own self-healing processes that can be unlocked by this ritual.
It's no longer a lie.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to participate in your own healing.
That's a great way to put it.
The groundbreaking moment for this whole concept, it really came in 2010 with that big IBS trial led by Ted Kapchuk and his team.
Yeah.
This study wasn't just interesting. It was a methodological gauntlet thrown down to decades of medical thinking.
It was. They had to prove that the effect wasn't just, people getting better on their own or regression to the mean.
Right, the natural course of the illness.
So they took patients with irritable bowel syndrome, a classic functional disorder that's known to be very responsive to placebo, and they randomized them into two groups.
Okay.
The first was the OLP group. The second was a strict no treatment control group. Basically, a wait list.
And the OLP group, what were they told specifically?
The instructions were incredibly direct. They were told, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is a placebo pill, like a sugar pill, with no medication in it. However, clinical studies have shown that placebo pills can produce significant mind-body self-healing processes.
So they framed the placebo effect itself as the active ingredient.
Exactly, and they were told to take it faithfully.
And what were the results of that 21-day trial?
The outcomes were really compelling. The OLP group reported significantly higher global improvement scores compared to the no treatment group. They also saw a clinically meaningful reduction in their symptom severity.
And it wasn't a small effect.
Not at all. The percentage of OLP patients who reported achieving adequate relief was substantially higher than the waitlist control. It was really the first definitive proof that OLP works even with completely open disclosure when you compare it against doing nothing at all.
This wasn't just a talking cure then. It was a specific measurable intervention.
That's the key point. The pill, the ritual, the rationale, that whole package was the intervention.
That trial was seminal. But what I find even more fascinating is the qualitative data that came out of later studies. We often have this assumption that the OLP patient is just highly suggestible or, maybe a bit gullible.
Right, that they just want to believe.
Exactly. But the interviews with these patients paint a much more complex and, frankly, more interesting psychological picture.
They absolutely do. If you look at patients in a traditional double-blind placebo or DBP trial where they don't know if they're getting the active drug or the placebo, those patients are typically very enthusiastic. They're really holding out hope for the active medication.
But the OLP participants, they weren't necessarily enthusiastic, were they?
No, not in the same way. They often express feelings of hope, which is a key word we'll come back to, and curiosity, but they were also ambivalent about their allocation.
A bit skeptical, even.
Yes, a healthy skepticism. There was less emotional investment than in the DBP group. And when they started feeling better, this is the really interesting part, they didn't just immediately attribute it to the pill.
They questioned it.
They engaged in conscious self-reflection. They would ask themselves things like, am I just imagining this? Or is this just a normal up and down in my symptoms?
So instead of being passively healed, they became these active, critical observers of their own bodies.
Exactly. They were far more reluctant to attribute their improvement directly to the OLP treatment itself compared to the DBP participants. They often described the intervention as a problematic perturbation. It shook up their routine.
A perturbation. That's a great word. It forced them into a state of heightened self-awareness.
And that's actually a crucial clue for how the whole mechanism works.
That complexity takes us right back to the ethical critiques, though. Critics still argue that OLP isn't fully transparent. They use this word equivocation.
The argument being that the doctor is still sort of misleading them.
Right. The idea is that the doctor intends for the patient to believe the placebo will be effective, potentially by glossing over how it works, maybe even relying on the past results that were derived from those deceptive trials.
It's a fair philosophical point to raise, about the power dynamic and the potential ambiguity in the physician's rhetoric.
Sure.
However, I think the ethical discussion needs to center on patient acceptance of this so-called equivocation, not just the philosophical purity of the doctor's intent.
And how do patients feel about this? Do they feel misled?
The surveys are overwhelmingly positive. In one study that gauged public attitudes, 95% of respondents agreed with the statement that just thinking positively can improve physical symptoms.
So the public already buys into the core concept.
Yes, the public is already there. They accept the idea that the mind and body are connected and capable of self-healing. So when a doctor frames OLP not as a trick, but as a way to leverage that accepted process, the ethical dilemma largely just dissolves.
And in fact, you could argue that OLP actually surpasses the existing AMA guidelines on placebo use.
I think you can. The old AMA rules were designed to manage concealment. They permitted use if the patient knew a placebo might be used but couldn't identify which pill it was. OLP is radically transparent.
You know exactly what you're getting and when.
Exactly. The patient is informed of the precise timing and identification of the pills as placebos. This fulfills the requirements of informed consent completely. It transforms the placebo from this, murky ethical conflict into a legitimate, transparent therapeutic tool.
So we've established a strong case that OLP can be ethical. But the big question remains, is it powerful? Let's shift our focus to the hard data. We have this massive systematic review, 60 randomized controlled trials, over 4,500 participants, that synthesizes the entire field. What are the major takeaways?
The headline is crystal clear. OLP works. The comprehensive review confirmed that it yields a small but clinically relevant positive effect across a whole range of health outcomes.
Okay, what does that look like in numbers?
The overall pooled effect size, which is measured using the standardized mean difference, or SMD, was 0.35.
Let's pause on that 0.35 SMD just for a second. Can you break down what that means in practical terms? How does that compare to other, say, common pharmaceutical treatments?
Sure. The SMD is just a way to standardize results across all these different trials and different outcome measures. It tells you how much the treated group improved compared to the control group. An SMD of 0.2 is generally considered a small effect, 0.5 is medium, and 0.8 is large.
So 0.35 is small to medium.
Robustly small to medium. And here's the crucial part. For many chronic conditions, like certain types of pain or even depression, the effect sizes of well-established pharmaceutical interventions often hover right around that 0.3 to 0.5 range.
You're kidding. So OLP is delivering an effect that is comparable in magnitude to what many active drugs achieve in these really hard-to-treat conditions.
In many cases, yes. Which immediately makes it relevant, doesn't it? Especially when you consider that OLP has virtually no side effects.
That's a huge point. Now let's look at where OLP works best. The systematic review broke down the effect size by population, right?
It did, and this is a really important distinction. The OLP effects were significantly stronger in clinical samples. So people who were genuinely suffering from the condition they were being treated for. There, the FND was 0.47.
Almost a medium effect size.
Exactly. And that contrasts with non-clinical samples, like healthy college students used in lab studies, where the SMD dropped to 0.29.
So what does that tell you?
It tells you that OLP isn't just about, boosting the mood of healthy people. It appears to be most potent when it's applied to actual felt distress in a real clinical setting. The need seems to amplify the effect.
And did the researchers also look at the different control groups? I mean, did OLP only beat out doing nothing, or did it hold up against other forms of inert control?
It held up against everything. No treatment, waitlist treatment as usual, and even covert placebo, where people get a placebo but don't know it. There was no significant difference in OLP's efficacy against these different control types.
So the benefit is really tied specifically to the OLP intervention, with its open disclosure and its rationale. It's not just the simple act of being in a study or getting attention.
Precisely. The effect is real and specific to the OLP package.
Okay, now we come to what I think is the most defining characteristic of OLP's efficacy, and frankly, the most challenging finding for some critics. The distinction between self-report outcomes and objective outcomes.
This is the absolute crux of the OLP story. The effect size differed significantly based on what was being measured.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When researchers looked at self-report outcomes, that's the patient's own experience of their pain, their perceived fatigue, their global assessment of how they feel, OLP showed a clear beneficial effect. The SMD there was 0.39.
Okay, strong and clear. But when they look at objective outcomes...
That's where things get interesting, when they looked at objective outcomes. So measurable physiological things, blood markers, specific observable behaviors, or clinician-rated scars, the effect size it dropped off a cliff. For objective outcomes, OLP showed virtually no significant effect. The SMD was a tiny 0.09.
Wow. So let me make sure I'm getting this. OLP is primarily changing a person's perception and experience of their illness.
That is the crucial finding. Its main therapeutic target seems to be subjective suffering.
But wait a minute. If OLP isn't changing the underlying physiology in a way we can objectively measure,
Yeah.
can we still call it healing? I think this is where the dialogue has to get really challenging.
Seems the vital question, isn't it? And the answer depends on how you define the goal of medicine. If the goal is solely to alter objective biological markers, then yes, OLP might be deemed weak.
Go ahead.
But if the goal of medicine is to reduce suffering, to improve function, and to enhance quality of life, which are all inherently subjective metrics, then OLP is highly effective. Think about chronic pain or IBS. The suffering is the perception. If OLP can reduce your perception of pain by 40%, you have been healed in a meaningful way, even if the underlying tissue damage, if any, remains the same.
And you mentioned this pattern, larger effects on patient-reported outcomes than on objective ones. That's actually consistent with what we see in deceptive placebo research, too.
Exactly. It suggests this is a fundamental characteristic of the mind-body response itself, whether it's triggered transparently or by concealment. It's the activation of the body's own subjective relief pathways.
This brings us to the importance of the delivery, the therapeutic ritual. We noted earlier that the rationale provided by the clinician is key. How much does that suggestion factor into OLP's success?
It factors in enormously. The review analyzed this specifically. The studies that used a rationale with a high degree of suggestiveness, meaning they actively work to build positive expectations, they explain the mind-body link, they emphasize the automatic nature of the effect, those trials consistently showed a positive effect. The SMD was 0.38.
And conversely.
Conversely, if the rationale was delivered flatly with a low degree of suggestiveness, basically just saying, here's a sugar pill, take it, the effect size plummeted. It failed to yield any significant effect. The SMD was just 0.11.
So this is the hard evidence that OLP is not just about administering an inert substance. It's about administering a context.
Yes. The ritual of receiving a pill from a trusted professional, combined with a compelling narrative about self-healing. That is the active ingredient. The communication is a medicine.
Let's explore some of the specific success stories that really highlight this ritual and communication aspect. Let's start with chronic low back pain, or CBP.
The CBT trial was a major milestone. In that study, they added OLP to treatment as usual, or TAU, and they found it significantly reduced both pain intensity and disability compared to just TAU alone.
And the effect size for disability was quite large, wasn't it?
It was a large effect, yes, which is huge because disability is what really impacts people's lives.
But the real clincher for me was the 5-year follow-up data, a 3-week intervention leading to a 5-year effect. That is phenomenal. How do they maintain that benefit for so long?
The persistence of the effect was remarkable. After 5 years, the improvements in pain and disability were still there. But the most powerful finding, I think, was the lasting behavioral shift.
In what way?
At the start of the study, 87% of the participants were using some form of pain medication. Opioids, NSAIDs, you name it. 5 years later, that figure had dropped to only 38%.
That is a massive reduction in reliance on pharmaceuticals.
It's incredible. It suggests the OLP intervention didn't just mask the pain temporarily, it fundamentally altered the patient's relationship with their pain and their strategy for managing it. It seems to have facilitated a sense of self-agency.
Like the OLP ritual served as a powerful cognitive and emotional recalibration event. It gave them a non-pharmacological pathway out of chronic dependence.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it.
Let's look at another tough one, cancer-related fatigue, or CRF. This is a terrible, debilitating symptom, often very hard to treat.
And OLP showed definite efficacy here, even in advanced cancer patients. In one study, OLP significantly reduced CRF severity compared to a waitlist control within just 1 week.
1 week is very fast.
Very fast. And that improvement held for 4 weeks. The change score on the fatigue assessment was 3 times higher in the OLP group. It was 6.6 versus the control group, which was just 2.1.
And we saw similar success in cancer survivors too, right? They often struggle with this persistent long-term fatigue for years after treatment ends.
Yes, in cancer survivors, OLP improved fatigue severity by 29% and significantly enhanced quality of life by 39%. Again, these are clinically meaningful reductions in suffering, achieved through a transparent, non-pharmacological method.
Okay, finally, let's touch on menopausal hot flushes. The qualitative data here again highlighted that interesting distinction between attitude and expectation.
It did. The women in the OLP group for hot flushes, they actually reported low initial expectations, which is so interesting. They weren't Pollyannas about this sugar pill.
They didn't think it was a magic bullet.
Not at all. And yet they still benefited. Their operative attitude wasn't, I expect this to work, but it was more like, I'm open to this working, or I hope this works. It was an openness to change.
And the act of keeping a diary seemed to be key in that study.
Absolutely. The act of symptom monitoring itself, which was prompted by the OLP treatment context, became a valuable tool for self-examination. It gave them an opportunity to appraise their symptoms, to notice the natural fluctuations, and ultimately to enhance their sense of control and agency over what is a difficult, autonomous bodily process.
So the OLP essentially converts the patient from a passive recipient of symptoms into an active investigator of their own internal state.
Exactly. It's an empowering process.
This brings us to the absolute heart of the mystery. We've established that OLP works, that it's mediated by the narrative, and that it influences our subjective perception. But how? How does the brain allow us to experience real relief when we consciously know the truth? This is where the traditional psychological theories really start to fall short.
They do. They really do. Primarily because the dominant models we've relied on, things like conscious expectation and classical conditioning, they just don't fit the OLP profile.
Why not? Let's take conscious expectation first.
Well, if it were simple conscious expectation, the disclosure, the doctor saying this is a sugar pill, should instantly negate the effect. But it doesn't. And what's more, OLP patients have often failed many other treatments, so their actual conscious expectation level is often quite low to begin with.
Okay, so it's not conscious expectation. What about classical conditioning? The whole Pavlov's dog idea.
Right. The idea that a neutral stimulus, like a pill, has been repeatedly paired with an active drug in the past, so it starts to trigger a conditioned response. That's also usually absent in these OLP interventions. They don't typically involve any prior drug pairing.
So what's the deeper flaw in these old models?
I think the deeper flaw, as many cognitive scientists now point out, is that these traditional theories rely on a kind of flawed assumption of mind-body dualism.
A ghost in the machine.
Sort of. They imply there's this centralized control panel, a mini-me in the brain, that gets the healing message and then consciously commands the body's opioid receptors to fire or what have you. The complexity of the placebo response, which involves very specific biological and neurological changes, it just defies this simple top-down command structure.
So if the conscious mind isn't commanding the body, how do these external messages of healing, the ritual, the doctor's words, reach specific targets like our pain pathways?
The answer, or at least the most promising answer right now, lies in this revolutionary model of the brain called the Predictive Processing, or Bayesian Brain model.
Okay, this is a big one. Let's unpack it slowly.
This model shifts the entire paradigm. It posits that the brain is not primarily a reactive processor, just passively receiving sensory data from the outside world. Instead, it's a proactive hypothesis generator.
A prediction machine.
A prediction machine. The brain constantly generates predictions about the world and, crucially, about the body's internal state. These predictions are what we call priors.
Can you break down priors simply for us?
Sure. Think of priors as your brain's deeply ingrained assumptions or beliefs. If you've had chronic low back pain for 5 years, your brain's primary prior is, I am a sick person, or my back is broken and it's going to hurt today. This is a very robust, very rigid hypothesis.
And it filters all incoming information through that lens.
Exactly. So when new sensory input comes in, let's say a tiny muscle twinge, the brain interprets that twinge through the powerful lens of the pain prior. It amplifies it. This is what we often call central sensitization.
So the experience of symptoms like pain or illness isn't just raw sensory input. It's a prediction that's built by integrating the current input with these powerful historical assumptions, the priors and the current context.
Yes. The symptom amplification is the brain desperately trying to make reality match its prediction.
The experience of recovery, then, must be the process of updating those priors.
It is. It's the brain deciding to switch to a new, healthier hypothesis. I am healing, or my symptoms are diminishing. And this process is driven by minimizing prediction error. That's the mismatch between what the brain expects to feel and what it actually senses.
This is where OLP comes in as a powerful disruptor, then. If the brain is stuck in a rigid prediction of sickness, the OLP ritual has to provide overwhelming new evidence to force an update.
Yeah, that is exactly right. The OLP intervention, the whole package, the doctor-patient interaction, the compelling rationale, the specific action of taking a pill, It provides strong, external, and highly salient cues that directly contradict that old rigid sickness prior.
So the OLP doesn't change the body's biochemistry directly.
It changes the prediction of the body's biochemistry.
And the core challenge for the brain in an OLP situation is the dissonance it creates. It's this conscious knowledge clashing with this non-conscious action.
Yes, that's the beautiful conflict at the heart of it. We call this the mismatch between your propositional cognitive knowledge and your embodied routines and motor responses. Meaning, your rational mind knows, I am ingesting microcrystalline cellulose, but your deeply programmed embodied system is performing this ancient, powerful healing ritual. I am taking medicine prescribed by a trusted medical healer.
And the model suggests that in this moment of conflict, the automatic, non-conscious motor response, the ritual of actually taking the pill, can be more potent than the conscious propositional knowledge.
It suggests the body's performance of the ritual can override the mind's skepticism.
It's a wild idea.
It is, but we see it all the time. The analogy that's often used works perfectly here. Think about watching a Greek tragedy like Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
Intellectually, propositionally, that actors on stage are fine. The balcony is just a set piece and the ending is completely scripted. You know it's not real.
Right.
And yet the ritual of the performance, the set, the lighting, the music, the dramatic tension, it compels a real embodied emotional response. You feel genuine fear, you might cry, your heart rate actually changes, your affective and motor systems fire regardless of your rational certainty.
OLP is essentially harnessing that deep, non-conscious, embodied ritual capacity for self-regulation.
Exactly. And this leads us back to that psychological posture of hope that OLP patients so often describe, rather than strong expectation.
Right. They're not certain it will work. They're hopeful. Why is hope better than expectation for this mechanism?
Well, strong, explicit expectation can actually be fragile. If you absolutely expect a complete cure and your symptoms persist even a little bit, the crash of disappointment, that sudden influx of massive negative prediction error, can actually make your outcomes worse. It confirms the sickness prior. This is the paradox of expectation.
So hope is a softer, more flexible prior.
It is. It allows the patient to face the grim reality of their chronic sickness while maintaining enough neurological openness to accept new evidence of improvement without the high-stakes risk of total disappointment.
It creates a state of, productive uncertainty?
That's a great term for it. The ambiguity of the OLP intervention, this strange, counterintuitive pill, serves as a neurological attention signal. It basically tells the brain, hey, pay attention. Something new and potentially contradictory is happening here.
And that heightened salience, that focus, directs neurological resources toward the symptoms.
Allowing small, real internal changes to register as genuine improvement, which minimizes prediction error and helps establish the new, healthier prediction.
So OLP is really a therapeutic tool for modulating attention and uncertainty, not just for symptom relief.
And we have hard neurobiological evidence to back all of this up. We are way past the point of just saying, oh, it's all in your head. We know for a fact the placebo effect involves measurable organic processes like the release of endogenous opioids and dopamine.
But the OLP studies have been even more precise about where this neurological updating happens in the brain, right? What have the functional MRI studies on OLP for chronic back pain revealed?
They showed genuine, detectable brain changes. When pain was evoked in participants after they had taken an OLP, the researchers observed significantly increased activity in two key areas: the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, or RACC, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC.
And why are those two regions so important?
The VMPFC and the RACC are key hubs involved in pain modulation, emotional regulation, and integrating our cognitive control with our affective processing. Essentially, they're the areas responsible for the cognitive reappraisal of pain. They help the brain decide how much that raw sensory input matters.
Okay, so activity there goes up. What goes down?
Simultaneously, OLP decreased activity in the sensory areas that relay the raw pain signal, like the somatomotor cortices and the thalamus.
So the brain isn't necessarily stopping the pain signal at its source, but it is turning down the volume and changing the emotional interpretation of that signal through these sophisticated cognitive control centers.
That is a perfect summary. And furthermore, researchers have now identified a specific neural circuit involving the RACC, the pontine nucleus, and the cerebellum as being central to this analgesic response. It links the cognitive emotional centers to the brainstem's own pain modulatory pathways.
So this is the organic machinery of self-healing in action.
It is, and it's quantifiable. It proves that the therapeutic ritual leads to genuine physiological changes in the brain that go way beyond simple subjective reporting.
It's really the clearest possible evidence that OLP is effective because it's a neurological event, leveraging the embodied ritual to force the brain to abandon its self-defeating prediction of chronic sickness. Okay, so OLP really seems to represent the pinnacle of transparency in ambiguous prescribing, the doctors being completely honest about the inert nature of the pill. To understand its full ethical significance, I think we need to compare it to the vast, ethically murky world of off-label prescribing.
This comparison creates an essential ethical mirror. It really does. Off-label prescribing, just to define it, involves using a drug that has received regulatory approval, say from the FDA, but prescribing it for a condition, an indication that the regulatory body has not specifically approved it for.
We tend to think this is a rarity, something that happens on the fringes, but the data shows it is incredibly common.
Widespread is an understatement. Even in older sample data, an estimated 21% of all drug uses were off-label. And for specific drug classes, it was just rampant. Cardiac medications and anticonvulsants both had off-label rates around 46%.
Almost half of all prescriptions.
Almost half. And the prevalence increases dramatically for older generic medications where the pharmaceutical companies have very little financial incentive to fund new, expensive approval trials for every little indication.
Right, like tricyclic antidepressants or TCAs.
A perfect example. They had the highest off-label rate among all antidepressants at over 81%. That was driven largely by one drug, amitriptyline, which was used off-label 93% of the time.
Wow. And what about trazodone?
Trazodone is another great example. It's overwhelmingly prescribed off-label for insomnia. That single use accounts for over a quarter of all off-label antidepressant prescriptions.
So the sheer volume of this means millions of patients are receiving drugs for purposes that were not supported by the original clinical trials. But the critical question is, what's the evidence base for these uses? Is this informed evidence-based practice, or is it just guesswork?
This is the ethically troubling part. The vast majority, 73% of off-label drug uses identified in the major analyses, had little or no strong scientific support.
No data from large-scale randomized controlled trials.
Correct. Only about 16% of these prescriptions were supported by rigorous, strong scientific evidence for that specific off-label indication.
So we have millions of prescriptions involving a lack of rigorous evidence, and often, I would assume, without full transparency to the patient regarding that lack of evidence.
And that lack of transparency, not about the drug's activity, but about the validity of its use for this purpose, that is the key ethical difference between off-label prescribing and OLP.
Let's look closely at a specific example to see how doctors navigate this. The use of those TCAs for chronic functional gastrointestinal disorders, like IBS.
This is a perfect case study because the drug, an antidepressant, carries a very strong stigma when you prescribe it for a primarily physical ailment.
Right. The patient immediately thinks, my doctor thinks this is all in my head.
Exactly. And interviewed gastroenterologists were keenly aware of this, so they developed a specific strategy to manage this patient stigma.
And what was that?
They would very carefully emphasize the biological, non-psychological mechanism of action. They would explain that TCAs at these low doses work by changing pain perception pathways in the gut-brain axis, not by treating depression. They would reframe the drug as a gut pain modulator.
So they were providing a therapeutic rationale, a story, much like the OLP rationale, but it was designed to distance the pill from its primary psychiatric indication.
Precisely. They were creating a narrative to manage expectations and avoid stigma. Yet, paradoxically, even as they were emphasizing this purely biological mechanism, they were being highly attentive to the psychology of the patient.
How so?
They meticulously adjusted patients' expectations. They encouraged realism about how much symptom relief they could expect. They carefully managed potential side effects. And they emphasized adherence to the treatment despite natural fluctuations.
It sounds like, just as with OLP, the therapeutic efficacy of these off-label TCAs relied heavily on the contextual conversation and the doctor's ability to set the correct non-conscious expectations.
That's the essential insight. They are essentially maximizing the non-pharmacological or placebo benefit of a drug that is active, but whose efficacy for this specific use may be largely contextual.
So both OLP and off-label prescribing are these complex maneuvers designed to navigate therapeutic ambiguity. In both cases, the physician is acting on the fringes of rigorous evidence.
Either by prescribing an inert pill, which is OLP, or a proven drug for an unproven use, which is off-label.
And the crucial difference is transparency.
It is. OLP is completely transparent about the inert nature of the substance. Off-label prescribing, on the other hand, is often very opaque regarding the lack of rigorous evidence for that specific treatment indication. And this raises serious ethical questions about informed consent and patient safety, especially if patients are led to believe a treatment is evidence-based when, in fact, it is not.
The data on off-label use just underscores the desperate need for better evidence for all treatments and for far clearer communication in the exam room.
Whether the pill is inert or pharmacologically active but unproven for that use, it seems the narrative, the ritual, and the management of patient expectations are absolutely paramount to the outcome.
The common thread seems to be that the context of care is often the most powerful aspect of any prescription. Hashtag tag outro. Well, we started this deep dive with the old medical premise that healing requires deception. We've not only challenged that, but I think we've established that transparency, embodied ritual, and a compelling narrative can be highly therapeutic on their own.
Open label placebos have successfully transitioned the placebo effect from an ethical minefield to a legitimate, transparent treatment strategy for these really difficult, chronic, self-reported conditions like IBS, chronic pain, and fatigue.
And the meta-analysis confirms this is a clinically relevant effect. It's particularly potent in clinical populations where the primary goal is the subjective reduction of suffering and the functional improvement of quality of life. And we know that the effectiveness hinges fundamentally on that suggestive rationale delivered by a trusted clinician.
And crucially, the mechanism moves beyond simple belief or conscious expectation. The predictive processing model provides the most compelling explanation we have so far. OLP functions as a powerful neurological event.
The ritual of administration, combined with the suggestive narrative, provides new external evidence that disrupts the brain's ingrained, rigid, maladaptive prediction of chronic sickness. The body's embodied routine overrides the mind's conscious knowledge.
The brain is actively inferring health based on the signals and the context we provide it. It's healing by neurological recalibration.
And this brings us back to the profound idea that these transparent placebo effects are, in fact, the specific effects of healing rituals. The ritual being the administration of care in a context of belief and hope.
If that's the case, it really changes the entire landscape of non-pharmacological symptom management.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to consider. If OLP works by utilizing embodied ritual and disrupting the brain's ingrained prediction of sickness, and if its efficacy is so heavily dependent on a suggestive rationale delivered by a highly trained and trusted clinician, should modern health systems start to formalize OLP protocols?
Should we dedicate resources to training practitioners not just on what to prescribe, but on how to deliver the OLP narrative in order to harness this powerful, ethical, self-healing mechanism for conditions where traditional pharmaceutical interventions so often fail or offer only marginal benefit?
It would mean we have to start viewing the context and the communication of care not as some background variable, but as a therapeutic tool, as specific and as powerful as any chemical compound.
A huge thank you for guiding us through this challenging and I think ultimately very hopeful research today.
And thank you, the listener, for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.